2,300 years before modern psychology recognized anxiety as a clinical condition, a former slave named Epictetus developed what might be the most effective framework for managing anxious thoughts ever conceived. He understood something that contemporary anxiety sufferers often miss. Anxiety isn't caused by external events, but by our judgments about those events. More importantly, he recognized that these judgments can be examined, questioned, and fundamentally transformed through philosophical practice. While modern approaches to anxiety often focus on symptom management, breathing techniques, medication, distraction methods, the Stoic approach goes deeper, addressing the cognitive patterns that generate anxious thinking in the first place. This isn't about suppressing worry or forcing positive thoughts. It's about developing what Epictetus called the discipline of assent, the ability to examine your thoughts before accepting them as true. What if the racing thoughts that keep you awake at night, the catastrophic scenarios your mind creates about future events, and the persistent worry that something terrible is about to happen could be addressed not through fighting anxiety, but through understanding its philosophical roots? What if the ancient Stoics had already solved the puzzle of mental tranquility in a way that modern cognitive behavioral therapy is only beginning to rediscover? Today, we'll explore how Stoic philosophy provides a comprehensive system for transforming your relationship with anxiety from the inside out. We'll examine specific practices developed by Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus that address the cognitive distortions underlying anxious thinking, and discover how these ancient techniques align remarkably with what neuroscience now tells us about rewiring anxious thought patterns. To understand how Stoicism addresses anxiety, we must first examine what the Stoics believed causes psychological disturbance in the first place. They identified what they called impressions, the initial thoughts or perceptions that arise in response to events, and distinguished between these automatic mental phenomena and our conscious choice to accept or reject them. Anxiety, in the Stoic framework, emerges when we accept impressions that are either false or focus on things beyond our control. When your mind generates the thought, something terrible is going to happen at tomorrow's presentation, that's an impression. The anxiety comes not from the impression itself, but from accepting it as necessarily true and important. This understanding revolutionizes how we approach anxious thinking. Instead of seeing anxiety as something that happens to you, a medical condition to be managed or an emotional state to be endured, Stoicism reveals anxiety as the result of specific cognitive habits that can be examined and modified through philosophical practice. Dr. Patricia Williams, a clinical psychologist who integrates Stoic principles with modern therapy, has observed that clients who learn to distinguish between initial impressions and their assent to those impressions show remarkable improvements in anxiety management. They develop what she calls cognitive sovereignty, the recognition that thoughts are mental events to be evaluated rather than truths to be believed automatically. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this approach in his personal writings, regularly examining his own anxious thoughts about imperial responsibilities, military campaigns, and personal losses. When he noticed himself worrying about future events, he would remind himself, confine yourself to the present. This wasn't denial of legitimate concerns, but recognition that anxiety about future possibilities was preventing him from addressing present realities effectively. The Stoics also understood that anxiety often stems from what we might call attachment disorder, becoming so invested in specific outcomes that any threat to those outcomes creates psychological disturbance. If your happiness depends on getting a particular promotion, maintaining a specific relationship, or avoiding all forms of discomfort, you've created conditions where anxiety becomes inevitable. Seneca captured this insight when he wrote about his own tendency toward anxious thinking. we suffer more in imagination than in reality. He recognized that most anxiety involves elaborate mental constructions about potential future problems rather than responses to actual present dangers. This philosophical perspective suggests that anxiety reduction isn't primarily about changing external circumstances or managing symptoms, but about examining the beliefs and assumptions that make certain thoughts feel threatening in the first place. When Caroline finds herself anxious about her teenage daughter's college applications, the Stoic approach would have her examine not just the worry itself, but the underlying beliefs about parental success, control over outcomes, and what her daughter's future actually requires for genuine flourishing. Long before cognitive behavioral therapy formalized the process of examining and challenging distorted thoughts, the Stoics developed sophisticated practices for what we might call philosophical cognitive restructuring. These techniques involve systematically examining anxious thoughts to determine whether they're based on accurate assessments of reality or distorted perceptions driven by fear. The first Stoic practice involves what Epictetus called testing impressions. When an anxious thought arises, instead of immediately accepting or fighting it, you pause and ask specific questions. Is this thought about something within my control or beyond it? Is this concern about the present moment or an imagined future? Am I responding to what's actually happening or to a story I'm telling myself about what it means? Consider how this might apply to workplace anxiety. When Thomas notices the thought, "My boss seemed annoyed in that meeting. I'm probably going to get fired," the Stoic approach would have him examine this impression systematically. Is his boss's mood within Thomas's control? Is he responding to actual evidence of job insecurity or to one ambiguous interaction? What would he need to know to assess his job security accurately, and what actions could he take based on realistic evaluation rather than anxious speculation? The second practice involves what we might call temporal perspective training. Anxiety often involves catastrophic thinking about future events or rumination about past mistakes. The Stoics developed specific techniques for returning attention to the present moment, not through mindfulness meditation, but through philosophical reasoning about what actually deserves mental energy. Marcus Aurelius regularly practiced this by reminding himself that past events cannot be changed and future events exist only as possibilities, not certainties. When he found himself anxious about military campaigns, he would redirect his attention to what required his immediate decision-making rather than allowing his mind to spiral through worst-case scenarios about battles that might never occur. The third practice involves examining what the Stoics called preferred indifference, recognizing that while some outcomes are genuinely preferable to others, your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on getting the preferred outcome. This creates what we might call outcome independence, the ability to work toward goals without being psychologically devastated if things don't unfold as planned. When Rebecca finds herself anxious about her startup's funding prospects, the Stoic approach would have her distinguish between rational concern that motivates effective action and irrational anxiety that undermines her decision-making. She can prefer to secure funding while recognizing that her worth as an entrepreneur and her capacity for future success don't depend entirely on this particular outcome. Research on what psychologists call psychological flexibility supports these ancient insights. People who can hold their thoughts lightly, observing them without being controlled by them, show significantly lower levels of anxiety and greater resilience during challenging periods. The fourth practice involves developing what Epictetus called reserve clause thinking. Instead of assuming that your plans must unfold exactly as anticipated, you include mental preparation for alternative outcomes. This isn't pessimistic thinking. It's realistic recognition that life involves uncertainty, and psychological peace comes from accepting that uncertainty rather than demanding guarantees. The Stoic approach to anxiety doesn't aim to eliminate all worry. Some concerns reflect legitimate care about important matters. Instead, it seeks to transform unproductive worry into what we might call philosophical wisdom, clear thinking about what deserves attention and what actions align with your values regardless of outcomes. This transformation begins with distinguishing between two fundamentally different types of concern. Productive concern motivates helpful action, preparing for presentations, maintaining relationships, planning for contingencies, addressing health issues. Unproductive worry involves repetitive thinking about problems you cannot solve, outcomes you cannot control, or events that may never occur. The Stoics developed specific criteria for making this distinction. Productive concern focuses on what you can influence and leads to concrete action. Unproductive worry focuses on what you cannot control and creates mental agitation without generating helpful responses. When Maria finds herself worried about her elderly parents' health, productive concern might involve researching care options, having conversations about preferences, and ensuring medical needs are addressed. Unproductive worry involves repeatedly imagining worst-case scenarios without taking any constructive action. This philosophical framework also addresses what modern psychology calls meta-anxiety, anxiety about being anxious. Many people compound their original worries by judging themselves for feeling worried, creating secondary anxiety about their mental state. The Stoic approach involves accepting anxiety as a natural human experience while maintaining agency over how you respond to it. Seneca demonstrated this beautifully in his letters, openly discussing his own struggles with anxiety while applying philosophical principles to address them constructively. He didn't pretend to be immune to worry, but he developed sophisticated methods for preventing worry from controlling his decisions or undermining his peace of mind. The transformation from worry to wisdom also involves what we might call values clarification. Much anxiety stems from being unclear about what actually matters to you versus what you think should matter based on social expectations or unconscious assumptions. When your values are clear, you can evaluate whether specific concerns align with what you genuinely care about or represent borrowed anxieties that don't serve your authentic development. Consider how this applies to social anxiety. If you're consistently worried about others' opinions of your appearance, career choices, or lifestyle decisions, the Stoic approach would have you examine whether these concerns reflect your authentic values or internalized social pressures. Do you actually want these people's approval, or have you unconsciously accepted that their approval is necessary for your well-being? The wisdom that emerges from this examination often reveals that many persistent anxieties are based on assumptions you've never consciously chosen to accept. When Kevin realizes that his anxiety about networking events stems from the belief that professional success requires being extroverted and socially confident, he can choose whether that belief actually aligns with his experience and values. This process of transforming worry into wisdom also involves developing what the Stoics call sympathia, the recognition that you're part of a larger system where individual events gain meaning through their connection to broader patterns. Your specific anxieties often diminish when viewed from this expanded perspective. How do these philosophical insights translate into specific practices you can use when anxiety arises in daily life? The Stoics developed remarkably practical techniques that can be applied immediately when you notice anxious thinking beginning to escalate. The first technique involves what we might call the discipline of first thoughts. Most anxiety spirals begin with a single concerning thought that triggers a cascade of related worries. The Stoic practitioner learns to catch these initial thoughts and examine them before they generate emotional momentum. When you notice the thought, "I think I might have said something offensive in that conversation," instead of immediately spiraling into social anxiety, you pause and ask, what evidence supports this concern? What action would be helpful if this concern is valid? What action is possible right now? This technique requires developing what Epictetus called prosauche, a state of continuous attention to your mental processes. Like a security guard monitoring who enters a building, you learn to observe what thoughts enter your consciousness and decide which ones deserve serious consideration. The second technique involves philosophical grounding, returning to fundamental Stoic principles when anxiety threatens to overwhelm rational thinking. This might involve reminding yourself of the dichotomy of control, reflecting on the temporary nature of all external circumstances, or reconnecting with your core values to provide stability during uncertain times. When Alexander finds himself anxious about a medical test result, he might use philosophical grounding by reminding himself, "I cannot control the test results, but I can control how I respond to whatever the results reveal. My worth as a person doesn't depend on having perfect health. I can handle whatever information I receive with courage and wisdom." The third technique involves what we might call anxiety scheduling, designating specific times for addressing legitimate concerns while preventing worry from infiltrating your entire day. Instead of allowing anxious thoughts to interrupt whatever you're doing, you acknowledge them and schedule time to address them systematically. This approach recognizes that some concerns require attention while preventing anxiety from becoming a constant background state. When Diana finds herself worried about family finances during work meetings, she might acknowledge the concern and schedule 30 minutes that evening to review their budget and identify specific actions they could take to improve their situation. The fourth technique involves developing what the Stoics called negative visualization, briefly imagining losing things you value in order to increase appreciation for what you currently have and reduce anxiety about potential losses. This isn't morbid thinking. It's psychological preparation that reduces the shock of actual setbacks while increasing gratitude for present circumstances. Research on stress inoculation supports this ancient practice. People who occasionally imagine handling difficult situations show greater resilience when challenges actually arise. The key is using this technique to build confidence in your ability to handle adversity rather than feeding anxiety about potential problems. The fifth technique involves philosophical journaling, writing down anxious thoughts and systematically examining them using Stoic principles. This externalization of internal worry often reveals how unrealistic or unhelpful many anxious thoughts actually are when subjected to rational examination. When you write down the thought, "Everything is going wrong in my life," you can examine it philosophically. What specific evidence supports this assessment? What aspects of your life are actually going well? What would need to change for you to feel like things were going right? This process often reveals that anxiety creates overgeneralized negative assessments that don't reflect actual circumstances accurately. While the techniques we've discussed can provide immediate relief during anxious episodes, the Stoic approach to anxiety ultimately aims at building long-term psychological resilience, the capacity to remain centered during uncertainty and maintain perspective during challenging periods. This resilience building begins with what we might call philosophical conditioning, regularly practicing Stoic principles during calm periods so they become automatic responses during stressful times. Just as physical fitness requires consistent training rather than only exercising during emergencies, psychological resilience develops through daily practice of examining thoughts, clarifying values, and choosing responses based on wisdom rather than impulse. The foundation of this conditioning involves developing what Epictetus called the view from above, the ability to step back from immediate circumstances and see them within the larger context of your entire life, human history, and the natural order. This perspective doesn't minimize legitimate concerns, but it prevents temporary setbacks from feeling like permanent catastrophes. When Julia's small business faces unexpected competition, she can use the view from above to recognize that business challenges are normal parts of entrepreneurial life, that her previous successes demonstrate her capability for adapting to change, and that her fundamental skills and relationships remain intact regardless of this particular outcome. This long-term resilience also requires what we might call values integration, ensuring that your daily choices consistently reflect your deepest convictions rather than being driven by anxiety about social approval, financial security, or other external factors. When your actions align with your authentic values, you develop confidence that comes from integrity rather than outcomes. The Stoics understood that much anxiety stems from living according to other people's expectations rather than your own carefully considered principles. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself to focus on being a good person rather than being seen as successful by others. This internal scorecard created stability during the inevitable fluctuations of external circumstances. Building resilience also involves developing what modern psychology calls distress tolerance, the ability to experience uncomfortable emotions without immediately seeking relief through distraction, avoidance, or compulsive behaviors. The Stoics recognized that temporary discomfort is an inevitable part of human life, and that developing capacity to sit with difficulty actually reduces its psychological impact over time. This doesn't mean seeking out unnecessary suffering or denying legitimate needs for support. It means recognizing that anxiety, like physical pain, often serves a biological function and doesn't require immediate elimination. Sometimes the most effective response to anxiety is simply acknowledging its presence while continuing to act according to your values. Research on psychological resilience confirms that people who develop strong philosophical frameworks for understanding adversity show greater emotional stability during crises and recover more quickly from setbacks. The Stoic emphasis on character development, virtue cultivation, and acceptance of uncertainty provides exactly this kind of framework. The ultimate goal isn't eliminating anxiety entirely. That would be neither possible nor desirable for most people. Instead, it's developing such a solid foundation of self-knowledge, clear values, and philosophical perspective that anxiety becomes manageable background noise rather than a controlling force in your life. The Stoic approach to anxiety offers something that purely symptomatic treatments often lack: a comprehensive philosophy of life that addresses the root causes of psychological disturbance rather than just managing their surface manifestations. By understanding anxiety as fundamentally a problem of misplaced attention and distorted thinking, you can address it through the same practices that develop wisdom, courage, and virtue in all areas of life. The integration of these practices into daily life doesn't require dramatic lifestyle changes or hours of meditation. It requires developing the habit of philosophical reflection, regularly examining your thoughts, clarifying your values, and choosing responses based on reason rather than immediate emotional impulses. This might involve a few minutes of morning reflection on your priorities, evening review of how you handled challenges during the day, or simply pausing to ask, what would wisdom look like in this situation? When anxiety begins to arise, the beauty of the Stoic approach is that it transforms anxiety from an enemy to be defeated into a teacher that reveals areas where your thinking might need clarification or your values might need strengthening. Each anxious thought becomes an opportunity to practice the philosophical skills that create genuine psychological freedom. Remember that even the greatest Stoic philosophers experienced anxiety. They were human beings facing genuine uncertainties and legitimate concerns about people and outcomes they cared about deeply. The difference is that they developed systematic methods for preventing anxiety from controlling their decisions or undermining their peace of mind. The path from anxious reactivity to philosophical tranquility isn't always smooth or quick, but it's available to anyone willing to examine their thoughts with honesty and courage. Every time you choose to respond to anxiety with curiosity rather than panic, wisdom rather than worry, and action rather than rumination, you're building the kind of inner strength that no external circumstance can touch. If you're ready to begin applying these ancient practices to your modern anxieties, start with one simple commitment. The next time you notice anxious thinking, pause and ask yourself whether this concern is about something within your control or beyond it. This single distinction, consistently applied, can transform your entire relationship with worry and open the door to the calm mind that the Stoics knew was your birthright. Subscribe for more practical wisdom that transforms ancient philosophy into modern emotional freedom. The journey from anxiety to tranquility begins with understanding that your thoughts are not your master, you are.